All right, now we can go ahead and get started. Those that are joining us on the live stream, sorry there was a bit of a delay, and phone decided to update at just the wrong time. But now we're live and on the air, on the net. I don't know which one it is, but we're live. We can get into our study, which we are in John 18 and 19. As we continue to study the Gospel of John. And here, especially as we get towards the end, we're looking at the trials and crucifixion of Jesus. In fact, as we did last week, we outlined the two chapters. Chapter 18, verses 1 through 12, focuses on Jesus' arrest. Verses 13 through 27 is his Jewish trial, which John doesn't say a whole lot about. He just gives a couple of details. It focuses also in that section on Peter and Peter's denials of Jesus. Jesus' Roman trial in John 18, verse 28 through chapter 19 and verse 16. The first part of verse 16, and then the last two sections, Jesus on the cross, verse 16 through 37, and then Jesus in the tomb, verse 38 to 42. And here is where we left off last week, is Jesus, and we're in the middle of his Roman trial, discussing Jesus before Pilate and all of the things that went on concerning that. We noted that John says more about the Roman trial. John says more about Jesus before Pilate than any of the other gospel writers combined. They say a lot more about the Jewish trial. John gives us a lot of focus on the Roman trial. Now, there are some details that other gospel writers give us. For example, John doesn't tell us anything about Jesus being sent to Herod, but there's still a lot of things that he does give us that other gospel writers don't. We asked this question last week. Why bother taking Jesus to the Romans at all? Why even go through this step? If they judge Jesus to be guilty and worthy of death, why even take him to Pilate? Well, for practical reasons, was because it wasn't legal for them to put anyone to death. Not that they always obeyed that. Somebody brought up last week that there were occasions when they tried to stone Jesus, or at least they wanted to. There was John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. They were prepared to stone her. And then in Acts chapter 7 with Stephen. Of course, that's after the fact, or after these events, but they stoned Stephen to death. And then a few other places within the empire. Think about Paul at Lystra. They stoned him, left him for dead in Lystra. Nevertheless, it wasn't legal. Technically, they weren't supposed to put anybody to death. So that's a practical reason that they brought Jesus to Pilate, or I would call that the Jews' reason. But then there's the divine reason. There's God's reason for why go through this step, and that's because it's Jesus himself had said, he had predicted how he was going to die. He had said that he would be taken to the Gentiles and crucified. He talked about being lifted up. Back in John 3, you remember he was talking to Nicodemus about how as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, that he himself would be lifted up. I think it's in John 12, he says, when the Son of Man is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. And not just words of Jesus, but Old Testament passages that seem to point to crucifixion. Psalm 22, verse 16, talks about his hands and his feet being pierced. Isaiah 53 and verse 5, he was pierced for our transgressions. Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10, they will look on him whom they have pierced. Now, John's going to use that verse a little bit later on in another context, but all of it points to this kind of death, this kind of executions, which the Romans didn't invent, but for lack of a better word, they perfected it. They became experts in crucifixion and making that a form of punishment. So let's talk about the different players in this scene. Let's talk about those who were involved in this trial. Let's talk about the Jews. How would you describe the behavior of the Jews, the Jewish leaders, through all of this? How would you describe them? Hateful? Yeah.
Power hungry?
I mean that's kind of how we got to this point, was they hated Jesus so much. What you said, another?
Power hungry?
Power hungry? Yeah, wanting to keep the status quo, not wanting to lose their position. Anything else?
Mob-like.
Yeah. I mean, really much. I mean, even going back to his arrest, right? He comments. I don't think John mentions it, or maybe John does. No. John doesn't mention it, but other gospel writers, Jesus said, you come out with swords and clubs, like I'm some sort of criminal. I don't remember the exact wording, but that's kind of the idea of what he said. Anybody else? I'll be honest, I'm kind of fishing for a particular word, but that's okay. All the ones that y'all have said are right. The first word that came to my mind was hypocritical. So much of what we see from them in these moments, it's so hypocritical. Some of the evidence of that, look at verse 28 of chapter 18. This is after, this is the very first verse of this section. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. I mean, every time I read that, it just irks me so bad. You guys are so concerned about your ritual purity, about not being defiled by going into a Gentile's house. And yet, you're going to condemn an innocent man to death. And even use the Romans as your puppets to do your dirty work. You're going to use the Gentiles to do your dirty work. If that doesn't strike as hypocritical, I don't know what does. And then even the next thing, this whole section, verse 28 through about 32, I guess, just makes my blood boil every time I read it. I get so mad. I mean, I'm thankful that Jesus went to the cross. Don't misunderstand that. But the way that he is treated, the way that these Jewish leaders act, it's just so frustrating. You look at verse 29. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Verse 30. They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." You know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of a preteen or a teen. "Mom, Dad, I want to ask you something, but you got to promise you're going to say yes." Parents ever deal with anything like that, or do that when you were kids, when you were growing up? "Mom, Dad, I want you to do something, but you got to promise you're going to say yes. I can't tell you what it is yet." How can they be so non-committal about, at least initially, about what they wanted done? Maybe they just didn't want to say it from their own lips. I don't know. Maybe it's part of that remaining pure, so to speak. They couldn't say it from their own lips. Now, from earlier gospel accounts, we know that they had declared him guilty. They had said that he was deserving of death. Go back to Matthew 26. Keep a marker there in John 18, because we are going to come back. Go back to Matthew 26. And somebody, when you get there, read verse 63 to 66. Matthew 26, 63 to 66.
But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Where do I go to after that?
66.
Okay. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What a further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is deserving of death."
There we go. They had a charge. Which, by the way, there's a lot of issues with that, little exchange right there. A person wasn't supposed to be condemned on his own testimony, but that's exactly what they did. The high priest was not supposed to tear his clothes for any reason, and that's exactly what he did. But they had the charge. They had the crime, or what they called the crime. He's a blasphemer. Why not just tell Pilate? He's guilty of blasphemy. He needs to be put to death. Think Roman governor cared about Jewish religious squabbles? No. So they couldn't come to Pilate and say, well, he's a blasphemer, we need him to be put to death. Then Pilate really could have said, hey, that's your own business, you handle it, which they couldn't do, but that's kind of the point of them not being allowed to do that. Now they did eventually bring a charge that Pilate would have cared about. If you go over to Luke 23 and verse 2, now, John doesn't mention this specifically, but Luke does tell us that when they bring Jesus to Pilate, we'll go back to Luke 23, verse 1, then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Now, only one of those was true. He was not misleading people. In fact, he even said, when they asked him about paying taxes to Caesar, what did he say? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God. The only thing that was true about that, he did claim to be Christ, which meant he claimed to be a king. Now that, Pilate might care about. And that's the thing that Pilate questions him on as we keep reading, as Pilate and Jesus get into their conversation. The first thing Pilate asks him is, "Are you the king of the Jews? Are you a king?" But those weren't the charges they pronounced him guilty for. So very hypocritical, very much a case of saying whatever they have to say to get their way. And that continues as we look down into chapter 19, verse 12 through 16, when they start bringing up, they bring Caesar's name into it. Verse 12, from then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to be crucified.
Justin, it's actually interesting right there in verse 23, chapter 23, verse 4. Pilate said to the chief priests of the crowd, "I find no fault in this man."
Yeah.
I mean, he even.
Well, he says it multiple times in John's account. We're going to talk about Pilate in a minute. He says it multiple times in John's account. I find no guilt. He's not guilty of any crime. But you look at what the Jews do here, of really manipulating Pilate through this, I called it false patriotism, as if they were loyal to the emperor, to the empire. Historically speaking, I think it's pretty well known that the Jews had no love for Caesar, for the Romans, for the empire. But in this case, if it met their needs in the moment, seems they were willing to fake some allegiance to him. And I think...
There's a hypocrisy.
Yeah. And I think you add to that, and they probably, I'm sure they knew this, that, historical sources will tell us that Pilate was already kind of on thin ice with the emperor anyway, because of some things that, there had been some uprisings, some riots and things like that. So he was already kind of, walking on eggshells, or, on that last that last strand or whatever, that he could be yanked back to Rome at any moment. And you didn't want to be a governor that got called back to Rome. It usually did not end well in that case. But this threat of not being Caesar's friend, probably it struck a chord. And ultimately we see that's what pushed Pilate over the edge. But they didn't care. The Jews didn't care about Caesar, about the empire, any of that. All they cared about was getting rid of Jesus, whatever it took. They had to be hypocritical, and I'm sure they didn't view it that way, obviously, but whatever they had to do to get rid of Jesus, that's what they were willing to do. But let's talk about Pilate. How would you describe Pilate in all of this? Characteristic, maybe. What's a word we could...
I'd almost say maybe he's trying to please the people too, and trying to finagle things to his benefit.
Yeah. He's playing the politician.
Mm-hmm.
He's very much playing the politician, trying to keep everybody happy, right? He's trying to keep Rome happy. He's trying to keep the Jews happy. He's trying to keep himself happy. He doesn't want, he really, he didn't want anything to do with all of this. And he says it a couple of times, verse 31, he tells them, take him and judge him by your own law. He did not want to be involved. Verse 30, chapter 19, verse 6. I think this was kind of said, kind of derisively, but he tells them, take him yourself and crucify him. If they couldn't legally stone anybody, they definitely couldn't crucify anybody. So Pilate knew that. So he was kind of saying it to them, mockingly. But he didn't want anything to do with it. Other gospel writers tell us, there was the incident. Pilate's wife came and she told him, I had a dream, and you shouldn't have anything to do with that man. And that kind of motivated him. He was all the more adamant. He wanted to have nothing to do with this. Other accounts tell us about how he, symbolically washed his hands. He said, I think Matthew tells us that because it's right after that. They say, his blood be on us and our children. But Pilate said, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm washing my hands of it. Doesn't mean Pilate was innocent. He can symbolically wash his hands all he wants. He still has a part to play. It's even suggested, I think in Luke 23, in verse 16, that when he had Jesus scourged, when he had Jesus, beaten with that whip, that scourge, that part of that was with the intent that would be enough, right? A lot of, at least some of the things that I've read, said that the scourging often preceded crucifixion, that it was intended to weaken the victim and things like that. But Pilate seems to be using it in this case, hoping that, we'll beat him within an inch of his life if he survives, and then the Jews will be okay. They won't want it. They'll be happy, right? He's been punished. Of course, that's not what happened. They kept crying out for him to be crucified. I can't help but see weakness in Pilate. I might even use the word cowardice. Right? As I said, he's playing the part of the politician, but he's a politician caught between a rock and a hard place. He's trying to uphold justice. He doesn't believe Jesus has done anything worthy of death. Right? That alone, he says multiple times, Jesus he's innocent. I find no guilt, no fault in him. Which, by the way, one occurrence of that should have been enough, right? He's kind of the highest law in Jerusalem. He's the Roman governor. He's the buck stops there. Buck stops with Pilate for the most part. I mean, it could go higher, but in general, he was the one things went to. If he said he's innocent, that should have been the end of it. But he doesn't let that happen. He wants to uphold justice, partially that was me.
Okay.
But at the same time, he wants to keep the Jews happy. And he seems to have this fear if he doesn't give them what they want. And it might have been a justified fear that if he doesn't give them what they want, there's going to be an uprising. And that's the last thing he wants. And so where he should have, and again, we're talking about all this from like a legal standpoint. Obviously, we know what God's plan was and how things were meant to play out. Pilate should have, he's innocent, that's the end of it. But he kept giving opportunity. He would not, so to speak, put his foot down and eventually gives Jesus over to be crucified. And then there's Jesus through all of this. If Pilate and the Jews frustrate you, as they do me, the way Jesus responds might, might embolden you to be more like him, to follow in his footsteps, to imitate him. I don't know. He actually speaks very little. Through all of his trials, he speaks very, very little. He doesn't say much. Usually it's just when a question is asked directly of him, such as what we read in Matthew 26 a little while ago. He was put under oath to answer. And then there are other examples of that in the Gospels. And here it's just a couple of occasions when Pilate questions him that he speaks. The first one is kind of that back and forth between Pilate and Jesus. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Why would Pilate be concerned about whether or not Jesus was claiming to be a king?
Interfere with his power.
Generally speaking, if you have a king already or an emperor, they don't like rivals, right? Think about Herod. All the way back in Matthew chapter 2, these wise men come from somewhere in the east. We don't know exactly where, but they come and they're, where's the king of the Jews? We've come to worship him. I can almost see Herod thinking, well, I'm the king of the Jews. What are you talking about? And what happens? Finds out where the child was in Bethlehem and goes down there and kills all the children, 2 years old and younger. So generally speaking, kings don't like opposition. Don't like somebody saying that they're also a king in their territory. So obviously that's going to be a concern for Pilate. Now, it could be, if Pilate determines that Jesus is a threat to the empire, then I'm sure Pilate would have had no problem right that second saying, yes, crucify him. Because we got to stop that nonsense. We can't let anybody be a threat to the peace of the Roman Empire. Keep in mind, this is in that period of history known as the Pax Romana. It's about a 200-year period of history where throughout the Roman Empire, there was a relative sense of peace. There were no major conflicts or wars happening. And it was very important to the Romans to hold on to that peace. That's why they had these governors in some of these different locations. That's why they had soldiers in these different cities, like Jerusalem, to keep the peace, to keep any problems from uprising. And if he thought Jesus was a threat to that, absolutely. I think right that second, Pilate would have said, yes, put him on the cross this morning, which eventually is what happened. But they wouldn't have had all this other discussion beforehand. But I think it's interesting how Jesus responds to that question. He doesn't answer directly, does he? Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" What does Jesus say? Verse 34.
Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?
Yeah. ESV says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" What's he trying to figure out?
Why he's asking what he's asking.
Yeah. Where did you get your information that I'm a king? Or maybe it's even more along the lines of, trying to get Pilate to really think about the source of his information. Because what was the source of his information? The Jews.
Believers.
Yeah. And we saw that in Luke 23 and verse 2. This man is claiming to be a king. And we know that the Jews really had no love for the Roman Empire. So it's almost like Jesus is trying to say to Pilate, think about the situation a little bit. And maybe to his credit, he was aware of that. The point is, his source should have made him a little suspect. Why all of a sudden do the Jews care about whether or not this man claims to be a king? There's something else going on here. And again, to his credit, maybe he was realizing that because he's hesitant to give them what they want. He acknowledges, he says, he kind of, in a roundabout way, says, what, I don't care about your little squabbles with the Jews. I'm not a Jew. Why does any of that matter to me? Is kind of the idea behind him asking that question. I'm not a Jew, am I? He says it's your own nation, your own people, your chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Obviously, you've done something to make them mad. Why are they so mad at you? And I feel like we should come to expect this by now. Jesus' answer being not really a direct answer to the question, but something maybe more profound, more needful in the moment. And we know what he says in verse 36 and 37. Verse 36 specifically, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world. It was not a kingdom that threatened Roman political power. It's not a kingdom that threatens any world power, for that matter, because it's not a worldly kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. And in reality, it could have coexisted harmoniously right alongside the Roman Empire. Within the framework of that empire, there could have never needed to be a problem. Just as today, the church exists harmoniously within worldly kingdoms. We live in this great country, and I know it's not perfect, right? I know that not everything goes the way that we would want it to. Not everything is right, but how often do we thank God for the freedoms that we have as American citizens to worship, to practice our faith, to go out and teach the gospel to other people, to support missionaries, to go to other places and to preach the gospel, some of which, by the way, go into places where they don't have, the church does not have such a good relationship with the government. The church is not a threat to that dynamic. How many times throughout the New Testament do New Testament writers say, obey the governing authorities, live at peace within that framework? Doesn't mean we agree with everything that the government does. Doesn't mean we disobey God if the government would tell us to. Right? We must obey God rather than men. But by and large, we're not rebels. We're not, rising up against the authorities, against the powers. You never see the church in the first century doing that. They turned the world upside down, as you see in Acts chapter 17. But how did they turn the world upside down? It wasn't by revolution, it was a kind of revolution, I guess. The teaching of the church is revolutionary, but they weren't trying to overthrow government. They were trying to overthrow the power of Satan in the hearts of men. They were trying to overthrow the power of idolatry in the hearts of men. And they turned the world upside down with the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not a worldly kingdom. If it were a worldly kingdom, then we'd be called to fight. We'd be called to take up actual swords. Or I guess in this day and age, guns and whatever. Yes, we are called to take up the sword of the Spirit, but we're talking about actual weapons. We're talking about things that can actually do harm. If the kingdom of God, if the kingdom of Christ were a worldly kingdom, he wouldn't have stopped Peter back there in the garden when he cut off that man's ear. He would have told Peter, keep hacking away. Keep going. They probably would have had more than 2 swords with them. There would have been probably, assuming that it was just Jesus and the 11, there would have been probably 12 swords, or maybe more. Maybe they can do the whole, dual wielding thing, 1 sword in each hand. They would have been fighting back. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. And I think there's an implied, because somebody can look at that, well, Peter tried. Yeah, but Jesus stopped him. If his kingdom were of this world, if he were trying to, be a worldly king, like a Caesar, like a Herod, or even like Pilate, a governor, what do you think they would do if somebody was trying to arrest them? They would call all their, their guards, their retinue, whoever, and say, get them. It's not Jesus. It's not his kingdom. He went peacefully. He told Peter, stop fighting. Because that's not what his kingdom is about. His kingdom is a kingdom of peace. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. They shall, their spears into pruning hooks. Same thing in Micah chapter 4 and verse 3. What does that mean? Their weapons of war, the things that they go out to fight with, they turn them into tools. Not for killing and doing violence, but for, turn the sword into a plowshare. What do you do with a plowshare? You plow, you harvest, you turn it into farm equipment. And you use that. Grow crops, feed the hungry. I don't know. The point is it's a kingdom of peace. Jesus is a king. Jesus is a king, but his kingdom is not of this world. We'll say more on that in just a minute. Yeah, Mary?
The Jews had the Old Testament, right?
Oh, of course.
When we read Isaiah 53, we're looking historically, but we understand that he was talking about the Christ.
Yeah.
So when they taught Isaiah, what did they teach the people? Because it seems obvious that they were looking for a king.
Yeah.
Jesus just didn't fit their idea of a king. And it seems also that they did not grasp the high priest and all of those people, even his disciples, did not grasp the concept of a spiritual kingdom.
Right, right.
And so they weren't looking for a king,
They were.
but it
Very.
wasn't Jesus.
Well,
So what did they take away from Isaiah?
as far as what they would have been teaching in the first century, I mean, there were certain passages that they understood, like they would have taken like Isaiah, that passage in Isaiah 2, and probably, and I'm kind of speaking off the top of my head, so I could be wrong, but I'm just kind of trying to put myself in their shoes. Thinking of myself in that context. What would I think about Isaiah 2? Do I even know that it's messianic? Do I even know that it's speaking of his kingdom? And if I do, what am I thinking that it means? I'm probably thinking that it means that when his kingdom comes, an earthly kingdom, it's going to be so great, it's going to rule the whole world, and there won't be any fighting anymore because he's going to rule everything. That's kind of where I see, Now, as far as like Isaiah 53, I know that even to this day, Jews still don't think that refers to Jesus. They struggle with that because, they were looking for a conqueror, a king. That is not what we read about in Isaiah 53. Because it's really not about a king. It's about a servant. We even call it's sometimes subtitled the suffering servant passage. So it would not have been, somebody would have read that and they wouldn't have thought, oh yeah, that's the guy we're looking for. I know in time past anyway, it may still be the case that a lot of Jews read that in terms of that's the nation of Israel and all the things that they went through, the things that they suffered over the years. Now, as for why couldn't they see it? And I think some passages they did see, but they maybe didn't fully understand them. But what do we have that they didn't? We've got a whole other 27 books that they didn't have in the New Testament. We have hindsight. We can read, and we have there's some passages that, New Testament writers have connected with Jesus that if I didn't have that connection, if I didn't have that inspired New Testament writer telling me, hey, that points to Jesus, I would just read it and think, oh, no, that's talking about somebody else. So we have that advantage of hindsight and of the inspiration of the New Testament telling us, oh yeah, that's what this was about. I'll give an example of, I talked about Sunday morning, Hosea 11 and verse 1, out of Egypt I called my son. If Matthew didn't tell me that somehow was fulfilled in the life of Jesus, I would have just thought that Hosea is talking about the Exodus. Simple as that. But since Matthew told me in Matthew chapter 2 that there's a reference to Jesus in that, and him being carried down to Egypt and then brought back out of Egypt, now I can make that connection. But there's a lot of those passages that if I wasn't told, I don't know if I'm making that connection. I think they were the same way, Again, there were some passages, like a lot of the things in Zechariah, probably they would have read and said, oh yeah, that's the guy we're waiting for. That's the guy we're looking for. But then in Zechariah is also the passage about the 30 pieces of silver and being thrown to the potter. They wouldn't have thought that had anything to do with their Messiah, necessarily. That didn't sound like the conquering king. What are you talking about? Right? Belinda.
I think it goes to show how far off the high priest and the leaders were, the Jewish leaders were, because they're the ones that are supposedly knowledgeable in the scrolls.
Supposed to be.
Supposed to be, but Jesus was teaching them at 12 years old.
Yeah.
And so here you have a high priest who's supposed to be from the lineage of Aaron, and these leaders, so it's their responsibility to tell the people, wait a minute, let me interpret, let's go back and look at the scriptures, just like we expect judges today to go back and look at old laws. What happened in this case? What happened in that case? They should have, been able to spot it, but I think that's how far off they have become.
Yeah.
It's a sign
And
of that.
I think you're absolutely right. They had just gotten so far away from, so much we read about, especially in the Gospels when it comes to the Jewish leaders, is their traditions. Their traditions that maybe started out based on the law, but then became something else. But I mean, if you go back and you read your Old Testament, it's kind of the pattern they follow time and time again. the Jews do in the Old Testament was because, they were given God's law at Sinai, and then generation by generation. What does it say? I think it's in Judges, I think. A generation rose up that didn't know Joshua. And what happened? They started to drift further and further away from God. And you go through that book and you have, that kind of roller coaster, although it's really more like a downward spiral that maybe goes up just a little bit every now and then. Just a tiny bit. Because they have these judges to kind of pull them back, but not really. It just keeps getting worse and worse. And then throughout the period of the kings, maybe occasionally you have a good king who calls the people back to the word or to God, and then that king dies, and it's usually worse than it was before, all the way to the point that you get to captivity, right? Assyrian, Babylonian, they're carried into captivity. They come out of that. You read Ezra, you read Nehemiah, they're doing pretty good. Not perfect. They had some things they had to work on, some things they had to fix. But then you read Malachi, which was written maybe 100 years or so after Ezra and Nehemiah. Maybe not quite that long, but it's the last book of the Old Testament. It's written about 400 years before Christ. And what are things like in Malachi? You're robbing God. You're covering yourselves with violence by divorcing your wives. You're, offering polluted things on the altars. And, Malachi tells them, hey, there's one coming. There's one coming. Elijah's coming. He's going to call you to repentance. And maybe at times there was, things were better. There were periods during the intertestamental period where maybe things were a little bit better for a little while. But you see, it's that cycle, right? They drifted from God and then they went back. This is one of those periods where they're drifting further and further away from God. It doesn't look the same every time. People still look to these chief priests and Pharisees and all that. They still look at them as righteous men, and maybe in certain ways they were outwardly righteous, right? Go and read Matthew 23. If you don't think they were outwardly righteous, go and read Matthew 23. They just, it's like you said, they got so far off the mark. They missed it. They missed it when it was he was standing right in front of them and telling them everything, and everything he said was actually in perfect harmony with the Word of God, with the Scriptures, with the law. Even going back to the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you, he wasn't changing the law. He was giving them a fuller understanding of what the law already said. So,
Well, even Passover, they didn't want to be defiled with Passover. Seems like they forgot what Passover was all about. I'm like, it's not about being defiled or undefiled. They're missing the mark. It's hard to see how far they had crumbled, fallen.
Yeah.
And even today, he's passed, our past, we are one generation away. Our generation that forgets God is a forgotten generation.
Yeah. And I don't want to end on a negative note, but that is very much true. And that's true in every generation, even the most righteous, All it takes is for one generation to go the wrong way to forget God. And there you have it. These Jews had gotten far off the mark. Well, I guess we'll come back next week and finish talking about the Roman trial. No, not next week. I won't be here next week. And then the week after that is our New Year's Eve prayer service and fellowship. So we won't be back in this until January. So, yes.
Before then, can you tell me what SPQ are?
It's there in the note, in that little footnote. It's basically I can't read it either. No, it's not written in there. It's a Latin phrase that became synonymous with the Roman Empire. I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
I can do a quick
I believe
reading.
you.
I can do a quick Wikipedia search when we're done. But thank y'all so much for your time, your attention. It's already 7:50, so I got to cut it off. Like I said, we'll pick up there in, I guess, 3 weeks. Wow. So y'all don't forget all this. We're going to come back to it.
Yeah, maybe next year.